Welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay, aka OMG Tarot. I'm back from Italy and excited to resume podcasting. I know I said I'd get this episode out on July 18th or 19th, and initially, I really wanted to. But as anyone who's ever been jet lagged knows, it's not easy. So, please enjoy it today. Today, we're talking about number 13, death. I had a few requests for this topic to come up next, and I get it. It's a dramatic card. If you're not familiar with tarot and you pull it up, it can be a scary card even. In any case, it's a transformative card. And in all my years of reading tarot, I've found that a lot of people who aren't familiar with tarot are at least familiar with what the death card means. Probably because it's so dramatic and can potentially be a bit upsetting. Say it with me, everyone.
Death card does not mean you're going to die.
At least not as the direct result of the reading you're doing right now. So what does it mean? It means transformation. It means rebirth. It means coming back after death, bigger and stronger and brighter and better than ever. Think of the imagery of the phoenix. After a life-altering shift, it rises from the ashes and flies again. And that's one of the images associated with Scorpio, the zodiac sign associated with the death card. You're probably familiar with Scorpio being depicted as a scorpion. After all, that's kind of part of its name. But Scorpio also has a few other lesser-known symbols. One of these is depicted in two places in your tarot deck, if you're using the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Those two cards are the Wheel of Fortune and the World. Take a look at the bird in the upper right-hand corner. That's an eagle. And yes, I know on the Wheel of Fortune that's an interesting interpretation of an eagle, but just go with it. The fourth symbol associated with Scorpio is the serpent. And now here's why Scorpio, unlike other zodiac signs, has multiple images. It's constantly reinventing itself. That Scorpio energy right there is I transform, I reinvent. I'm not who I was yesterday, and I won't be the same person tomorrow. This is important to keep in mind when you're interpreting the death card, but before we get off the topic of Scorpio, I want to explore these four images a bit further. They're the evolutions of Scorpio. Phase 1 is the scorpion, the small animal that only has one defense mechanism, and that's the stinger at the end of its tail. It may be very guarded and defensive because it has a lot of predators, and it needs to defend itself. Then it evolves into the serpent, who has fewer predators and has learned a few tricks up its sleeve to navigate a challenging world that it still doesn't totally trust. But also that serpent is continually growing and shedding its skin in order to maintain that growth. Then we have the eagle. The eagle is courageous and formidable and rises above challenges to soar. And then there's the phoenix, the one who rises from the ashes and lives again. Every sign evolves, but no other sign evolves like Scorpio. And that's really what the death card is about. Take a look at that rising sun between the two pillars in the background of this card, up above that priest's head. Of all the imagery in this card, I think this might be the most powerful because it symbolizes why death is happening. It's happening to close a chapter and setting the stage for the next chapter to begin. I think we've mentioned the imagery of two pillars in tarot before, and here we see them again, that concept of passing through a gateway and moving on to the next phase. But getting to that next chapter isn't always easy, and it's not always instant. Take a look at where it is in relation to our main character of this card, if we want to call them that. I'm looking at that skeleton who's riding the white horse. That gateway is all the way in the background, and against that rising sun, we see the shadow of a few mountains. In a few previous episodes, we talked about how mountains in tarot symbolize hurdles to overcome. And there are some hurdles to overcome here. Let's take a look at what else is going on in this card. The skeleton, who we can read as the symbolic representation of death, is riding a horse who's stepping over a dead person on the ground. In front of them, we see a priest who appears to be pleading with death, and two children, one of whom appears to be fainting or possibly in the process of dying, and the other who's looking up in awe. We can read this interaction as the inevitability of death, no matter what, whether you're pleading like that priest or looking up in awe like that child, Death happens. It's part of life. And notice the pace at which Death's horse appears to be trotting. Unlike certain other horses, like, say, certain knight's horses, this horse is moving slowly and methodically, carefully stepping over the things that are in its way. In fact, now that we mention the knights, Death kind of looks like a knight, doesn't he? I see the armor, I see the horse, and I see that big banner that he's holding up. Is Death connected to the knights? Think about that for a moment. There's got to be connection here, right? Otherwise, Death wouldn't be dressed like a knight. We haven't talked about the knights yet in this podcast, and we will, but right now, think of knight energy. And if you're not already familiar with the knights, think of them as very driven, youthful energy. They've got that zeal of the new convert. They're fresh, they're excited, they're also a bit inexperienced, but they're not as naive as the page. And they're very excited about whichever suit they are. So, for example, our Knight of Swords thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. Our Knight of Cups probably has notebooks and notebooks full of cringy poetry that he thinks are just the most profound, emotionally provoking thing anybody's ever written. But now let's bring that back to Death, because we have Death posed as if he were a knight. Perhaps this speaks to that theme of rebirth and rejuvenation that this card brings. To be perfectly honest with you, I haven't really thought too hard about comparing Death to a knight until I was doing research for this episode and really was forced to look more carefully and perhaps a lot more critically at this card than I ever have before. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I'm going to throw that up on Spotify for people to answer, and I really want to hear if you're a tarot card reader, what do you think about Death and the Knights, and is there a connection there? Let's take a closer look at that banner our skeleton is holding. It's a black flag with a white 5-petaled rose on it. You might recognize it as the White Rose of York. And if you're a history buff, you know there's a lot of symbolism tied up in this flag. It's the heraldic flag of the House of York, and it was first used in the 15th century. As a heraldic symbol, and in other places, this rose has been used to symbolize concepts like purity and innocence. And I'm reading this as that was what Pamela Coleman Smith likely meant when she included it in the Death card. Because it's important to keep in mind, there are no moral judgments in this card. This isn't death as in violence and killing, it's death as in the natural process that has to happen in order to make rebirth possible. And speaking of that white horse, let's just talk about it for a moment. We've seen a few biblical references in the deck so far, and this is another one. In the book of Revelation, there's a line that goes, "And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him." I'm no biblical scholar, as I know I've mentioned a few times in this podcast, but my understanding is that the book of Revelation is speaking to its readers and telling them to kind of hold tight and remain faithful, because as things are falling apart around them, they'll be rewarded with new life and new birth after death. And when Pamela Coleman Smith was designing this deck, it wouldn't be a reach to assume that a lot of people who would be working with this deck would be familiar with that book and its message, so alluding to it in this card could be a straightforward way to communicate what this card is about. A lot like we saw in the Lovers and how she drew them to allude to Adam and Eve. And, much like with the Lovers, Pamela Coleman Smith really kind of innovated this card when she chose to illustrate it this way with an overt biblical reference. If you take a look at older decks and their depictions of this card, a lot of times we see a skeleton who's holding a scythe, and different decks depict it somewhat differently, but the recurring theme is this skeleton who's holding a scythe and either waving it above some wheat or harvesting people in some way, possibly harvesting hands or feet or heads popping out of the ground. Do a Google image search for La Morte tarot card, or just type in Death card Marseille, and try both, why not? And take a look at what I'm talking about. So, we see the skulls and crossbones on the horse's neck that remind us of who this horse is and what this horse is setting out to do. We also notice that this horse has a red eye that really pops against its white fur. And then, if you shift your gaze over to the saddle that the skeleton's sitting in, it's red again, contrasting against the white fur. Remember the last time we saw a red and white color palette? It was over on the Magician. We see a lot of this color palette. Red is power. Although this is a white horse, and it's a horse of cleansing and rebirth, and it's innocent, it is just the draft animal that's carrying death. There's some power here. In fact, this is a very powerful horse. What's more powerful than death? Shifting gears a bit, let's take a look at which elements are present in this card. In the foreground, we've got Earth. All of the characters are standing on solid ground, and let's talk about that. Working through this cycle of death and rebirth can be very grounding. It provides a sense of security through rhythm and knowing what comes next and keeping your eye on the hope that comes next as you're focused over on those pillars and the sun rising behind them. There's also water here. There's that small puddle that's kind of in the foreground right behind the dead guy that the horse is stepping over. And then if you look immediately behind that, we see a long river with a boat sailing in it. Scorpio is a water sign, and water is associated with emotions. Transformation's emotional. Death is emotional. Rebirth is emotional. You can't separate the emotions from this card. And I think the presence of the water here is to remind us to feel our feelings as we work through these cycles of death and rebirth. That in fact, by feeling your feelings and allowing yourself that full range of human emotions, that's how you really get the most out of this cycle. The boat sailing down the river in the background could be a reference to staying afloat as you immerse yourself in your feelings and as you move forward closer and closer toward that rising sun. The boat and the river are often understood to be a reference to the river Styx from Greek mythology, which is the river in the underworld that separates the living from the dead. And if you take a look at that boat and then look just upward onto what we can understand to be the base of those hills along the river's banks, we see a cave opening, another reference to going deep into the underworld. When you come back out of the cave, you're not going to be the same as you were when you went in. So keep that in mind whenever you pull up this card in a tarot reading. It symbolizes a fundamental transformation that will make it impossible to go back to the way you were before. We see similar themes in the Tower, and in a future episode, I want to talk a bit more about the Tower versus death and how are they different and how are they similar. For today's purposes, remember that death is internal. A death moment is about you. How are you transforming and evolving and turning into a better version of yourself, however you might define better? To fully understand where death fits into the Fool's journey, let's drop it into the major arcana. As I mentioned earlier, it's number 13. It comes after number 12, Justice, and comes before number 14, Temperance. And I think this is the first time in the history of the podcast that both the previous card and the next card have already been covered. So, if you're interested, you can go back and listen to Justice, then listen to this episode, and then listen to Temperance to really understand how the three of them fit together as a sequence. At this point in the major arcana, we're into the back half. Technically, our midway point was somewhere between cards 10 and 11. However, you may hear of Justice referred to as a pivot point because that's the point at which the Fool determines that his actions have consequences, or you might think of Death as the pivot point because it's the part where he dies, not literally. In any case, this is the part where we're getting into those deeper, more esoteric lessons. We realize that death isn't the end and that we evolve. And that comes after the lesson from Justice, which is that life is nuanced and two things can be true at once. And when you find yourself in complex, layered situations that require you to make some kind of judgment or some kind of ruling, you have to carefully consider that nuance, because you're going to need that wisdom as you descend into the underworld and undergo a transformation that pushes you to re-emerge rejuvenated and refreshed and brand new. Then once you emerge, things are clearer. They make more sense. That's temperance. The long journey ahead seems doable. In fact, lots of things seem doable. Things seem possible in a way that they might not have seemed possible prior to death. You're approaching these things with wisdom and maturity, and perhaps a better sense of pacing yourself now that you have a second chance. When death comes up in a reading, what does it mean? It means a transformation is afoot. It means you are undergoing this process of completely reinventing yourself and evolving. Or, depending on the context, you could be watching somebody else undergo this process, and you could be being asked to get rid of what's not serving you in order to facilitate it. For example, let's say you ask your tarot cards, "Hey, I'm not sure if I should return to campus in the fall." If death comes up, I might agree that, yeah, perhaps doing things the way you had been doing previously isn't the best course of action for you. I think you kind of need a reinvention, and whether that means transferring schools or taking a break from school for now in order to really reevaluate your needs and your desires and your goals would be the best course of action. I think you outgrew what you had started initially, so it's time for change. Let's do another that puts death in context. I'd like to ask, hey tarot cards, what can I expect for my business in quarter 3? Now that it's late July and we're about 1 month into the third quarter. So I shuffle, and oh, there's death, and oh, there's the 2 of Cups. So my initial thought is there's a lot of water going on here between death, which we know is Scorpio, which is a water sign, and then the cups, which are associated with water. Quarter 3 is going to have some emotions happening here in my business, but I think they're going to be really positive because even though I've got death, that doesn't mean I'm going to close the business. It means I need to change how I'm doing things. And with our 2 of Cups, that says to me that I need to reinvent how I'm showing up as a peer among other businesses. That peak that caduceus between the 2 cups on the 2 of Cups, there's some healing and renewal to be had through reinventing how I'm approaching my relationships with other businesses. So, anyone up for a collab? If so, I'm here, because that's how you put death card energy into action. Embrace change and take advantage of every opportunity to reinvent yourself. And that about wraps it up for our discussion on the death card. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you learned something. This upcoming Thursday, my plan is to get us back to our normal weekly Thursday publishing schedule. So, stay tuned for the next episode of OMG Tarot. Until then, have fun with your deck and do some cool readings, and then tell me all about them. I love hearing what other readers discover. And I really would love to hear your thoughts on Death and the Knights and how he fits in, or doesn't, with the Knights. You can reach me on Instagram where my handle is its_OMG_tarot, or you can get me at my website, omgtarot.com. Alrighty, that's about it for tonight. Catch you Thursday.